Ladies and gentlemen, just moments ago, I was attacked and doused with water guns by my wife and family, and I am completely flustered. I feel that I have been hurt and taken advantage of. I have much to say about it, but I'm going to let Bob speak for me, because today on the Unconventional Pastor, Bob Greaves is going to be speaking. Bob, put the small violin down, please. Bob Greaves is going to be speaking on the subject of morality, and we're going to find out how he does and whose side he takes, mine or my wife's, in just a moment on the Unconventional Pastor.
Well, good evening. My name is Bob Greaves, and they call me the Unconventional Pastor. It's always a pleasure to be back with you. I enjoy these times that we spend together. The truth is, a big reason why I enjoy this is, I used to be a pastor in a church, and it was my responsibility to speak Sunday mornings and Sunday evenings and Wednesday evenings, and not all the churches always had all three services. But it was my job to speak, and there was a great deal of need to kind of keep it going, keep the series going, keep the institution running, and but also keep it going in a manner that was coherently within the identity of the church. And there was as I was becoming naturally far more unconventional, that was not an easy thing to do. And one of the things that I have found that I do enjoy here is that at the New Covenant Group, we do have a great deal of freedom to be who we are, to think as we do, and to express what it is that is on our mind as we're trying to seriously just honestly reflect on things as we see them, and there's no need in doing that to maintain a coherent story or to maintain a particular position, and so it's good. I enjoy being able to talk about many of these issues without feeling as though I'm obligated to uphold a particular. I don't feel obligated to maintain the position, say, that I had last week. Not that I'm, that unstable, but there's just no pressure. And when I first had a desire to go into the ministry, my concept of it was that the role I was going to play was going to be helping people to grasp for God. And I found that being a minister had very little to do with helping people grasp for God. And I feel that in this show, though, I have an opportunity to speak to issues that I hope do help some people kind of put things into perspective, so that as they're seeking to make sense of who's God, where's God, what's my connection, lack of connection, how do I deal with those issues, that I'm in a position to be able to really speak to what's really relevant in the questions of grasping for God. So I feel like, now that I'm no longer in a position where that's my paid job, they don't pay me to do this. I do this because I love doing this. I enjoy doing this. It is something, it's a dialogue I feel is important and useful, and I get to do this because it strikes me something that's a good idea. It's something good to do, and we're going to do it for that reason. So I do very much enjoy this. Tonight I'm going to be talking about morality, and part of the reason I want to talk about this is that I think that Christianity has traditionally, over the years and centuries, presented itself as if it is the necessary foundation of morality. And a lot of people who don't even stop to think about it just oftentimes simply assume that that religion is the basis of morality, and there are many people who, as Christians, even assume, falsely, I would say, that Christianity is a response to the problem of morality as presented in the Ten Commandments, and that the solution that Jesus offers us is a solution to the problems we have with God on the basis of the fact that we haven't kept the Ten Commandments. Now, something that I think is kind of funny when you stop to think about it is that the Ten Commandments that we have in the Bible, there's two different places where we receive the commandments, and they're different. Very different. And I'll leave you to look that up. But look at the two different places in the Old Testament where Moses presents these commandments to the people, and of course the stones are damaged, and then he goes back and gets more stones, and then they kind of like take two. The take two version is different, but nonetheless, they want many people want to perceive these Ten Commandments as the basis and the foundation of morality. I say nonsense. That's not true. In fact, I would see the law of the Old Testament, if there is any viability in it at all, it is that in an anthropological and cultural standpoint, the human race has to get to a point where it recognizes that the only law there really is love. But you can't just start there. It may not make sense, because if we just start there, we might feel like, well, all you got to do is just, like people and love them, and everything will be fine. That's not true. It's a little more involved than that. There are certain responsibilities and ethical aspects of philosophy that we really need to kind of work through. I'm going to sneeze here. Excuse me a second. I may not have been able to fight that sneeze off, but we'll see. Anyhow, it's a little more involved than that. Love is really the conclusion we come to, having worked out a process of properly eliminating the other contenders. And law is one of those contenders. I'll tell you what, here's the best way to get people to be moral. Stop doing that, do that. That sounds good. Doesn't work, but we might want to start with that. Now, in society, we have a variety of laws. We're a nation of laws. We believe in law and order as a way of offering to our society some sort of a structure that helps to maintain our society. And in that, it includes laws that say, if you're going to drive down the street, you're supposed to be on this side, not that side. And we have lines on the street, the yellow lines here in New York, you're not supposed to cross over them. The straight white lines, you're supposed to avoid going over. The dotted lines, you can go over them to pass or to move around things. We have various laws and codes and things that help us to function. Some of these codes have nothing to do with morality. Some of these codes merely have something to do with logistics and strategies and ways of getting things done that work for the culture. But law can be a way of really approaching the question of morality. But as we may quickly discover, it falls flat. It doesn't work. Although I think that to ancient man, it seemed like a good way to start. And so I guess I would see in some ways the Ten Commandments as something we had to work out of our system. I do not see the Ten Commandments as the actual law of God, in a sense, where these are the things that represent it. And there's reasons for that. Because, first of all, law, there's no way that a law can properly be enforced that deals with real morality. And that is because law can only properly deal with behaviors. Did you do this? Were you authorized to do that? Law can take outcomes into consideration when deciding what the response ought to be to having broken the law, or in deciding that the law hadn't been broken at all. But the outcomes are really a secondary consideration when it comes to law. But when it comes to morality, I'm going to argue that morality is really based upon, for all people, whether they realize this is what they're doing or not, it's based upon a philosophy of intentions, of decisions, and the outcome of actions. It's not really based upon what one necessarily ought to be intending, but rather the quality of the intentions that might exist as they come up in response to circumstances. Because you can't have a law about what your intentions ought to be, because the intentions are going to be a response of one's agenda to the circumstances one sees themselves in. And we can't have laws that are going to talk about all the circumstances you might be in, and therefore what your response ought to be to it. But it would be very difficult to try and do that. But when we're dealing with real morality, we're also talking about decisions. And decisions are something we go through when we commit ourselves to a course of action, having considered various options. And in making a decision, we're looking at those options so that the decision that we make is one that is going to produce what we hope to be the appropriate outcomes. Now, sometimes the decisions we make are intended to maintain an agenda. And I think that those are oftentimes, depending on the context, useful, but they can also be a very bad way of making a decision. If you're making a decision simply to maintain a tradition or to maintain a tradition, and you're not really considering the outcomes that are going to actually be created by that decision and taking that action, I think that there's a problem with the morality. I don't want to lose you here too much on some of the abstract stuff. But here also, morality is not based necessarily on the behaviors and the actions, but upon the predictable, understandable, and reasonable expectation of what the outcome of certain actions are going to be. For example, so let me try and bring this down to something more concrete. When you belittle a child, we might consider this to be something bullish and immoral for an adult to do. But I want to say this, that when the Apostle Paul said, I am convinced of this, that there is nothing that is evil in and of itself, that basically he's not saying there's nothing that's wrong to do. He's just saying nothing is wrong because doing that is wrong. Things that are wrong for reasons other than that they are being done. And so I think what he's trying to tell us is we're trying to get away from the focus on the actions and the behaviors, which are not the basis of morality, but rather the outcomes that those behaviors lead to. The belittling of a child is wrong, not because, child feels bad when you belittle them, and it's not nice to belittle a child. It's true it's not nice, and it's true that the child will feel bad. But the reason why I would consider that immoral is because children are beholden to the circumstances they find themselves in, even more so than adults are. Children lack the skills that an adult has to put into perspective the experiences they're going through, and the belittling of a child is far more likely to result in the child taking an inappropriate, unhealthy view of themselves, or to cause them to perceive themselves, even if it's not entirely true, to be in an unsafe situation in a manner that can affect negatively the healthy development that they're going through. And so basically what I'm trying to say here is that what causes this behavior to be immoral is not the behavior itself, but the various outcomes that behavior is likely to lead to. And it looks like we have a viewer comment coming in. Let me see if I can find that. Um, Paul says everything is permissible, but not everything is beneficial. I love this statement because it reduces morality to harm and benefit. I agree, and I think that this is exactly where Paul is going. And as a person who used to be a Pharisee, he's making this paradigm shift in realizing that we're looking to, okay, so if we do this, what's this going to lead to? What sort of results are going to come out of this? Because if we care about people, if we love people, we're more interested in the outcomes. Now, this is why, for example, love can sometimes do things that don't hurt. This is why sometimes it can be a loving thing to rebuke someone, to point out to them something they're not comfortable having pointed out. Now, I'm not saying that this is therefore our license, but some people sometimes can benefit greatly by experiencing certain consequences, by being exposed to certain responses and attitudes and ideas that we might have about the way they're behaving and the way they're acting, and trying to inform them as to just what outcomes are being produced by their actions. It can be a useful and helpful thing. Parents are often in a very difficult situation where they have to assess what they should do in response to some of their children's growing up and developing behavior and developing skills in taking responsibility for themselves, in trying to figure out what's the right thing to do here. And most parents will hopefully come to the recognition that the right thing to do is not based upon, well, you do this because that's right and you don't do that because that's wrong. Rather, you try to find the thing to do that is going to result in the best outcomes for all people involved in an honest, balanced, and authentic manner. And so that's what we're looking for in terms of what morality is. Now, so I think it should be obvious that by now I'm actually poo-pooing the notion that morality has anything to do with law. It really doesn't. Law cannot ever determine what all the possible options might be or what all the outcomes could be. And a lot of people want to say they want to say that morality is not relative. And to me, that is an absurd statement. Because morality depends entirely upon the impact. Now, there are some things that always create a certain impact. For example, if you put a bullet into a handgun, and at close enough distance, you point that gun at someone and pull the trigger so that bullet enters some very vulnerable part of their body, and that bullet goes through that and kills them. Chances are that in almost in the vast majority of cases, you can safely predict that the outcome of such an action is going to be the death of the person who gets shot. This is not likely to change from circumstance to circumstance. But so it's not that the morality is absolute. It's just that the outcome is more consistent, and therefore, because the outcome is more consistent, we're trying to base our morality absolutely on the outcomes and relatively on the sorts of behaviors that lead to various outcomes. So, to me, absolutism. By the way, let me just say this: we have another viewer comment I'm going to read here in just a moment. From a philosophical standpoint, I don't believe that relativity can exist without absolutism. Relativity is a relativity in respect to an absolute. If there were no absolutes, there could be nothing relative to it. So I'm saying that morality is absolute towards outcomes and relative towards the behaviors that produce those outcomes. Anyhow, viewer comment. When I was a child, I was taught not to do certain things because if I did, my parents would punish me. It was only when I left the house that I actually started taking self-motivated responsibility for my actions, because I learned that those acts that my parents punished me for had real-world consequences that I hadn't yet been exposed to. Realizing that my parents' punishment methods actually kept me from growing up and caused me to treat my children with what I hope are better methods, with less punishment and more guidance. Interesting comment. I can see that and let's be honest, parenting isn't easy and it's difficult. We're trying to do a good job, and we would love it. It would be so much easier if parenting could be reduced to, okay, you do this, you don't do that. This is a good policy, that's not a good policy, and let's just do it. But oddly enough, the real risk of parenting, and this is a risk, is we're trying to find a way of allowing the child to gradually over time develop an independent sense of self, so that by the time they become the adult, they are the ones making the decisions for their own, within their own processes, and owning them in responsibility. This means they need to kind of go through a process of discovering a great deal of these things for themselves, and sometimes guidance, and this statement here that was made, that the child needs to learn that their behaviors have outcomes. In fact, one of the things I like, there's a couple of different parenting books that I find very helpful. One is by a fellow named Dinkmeyer, Strategic Training for Effective Parenting. It's been a long time since I read it, but I read it back when my 21-year-old daughter was, I think I first read it when my wife was pregnant, if I recall correctly. So that was a while back, and I've reread it a couple of times in the interim, but I haven't read it recently. But I liked that book because it really talked about the goal of parenting being to get a child to own their choices and their behavior. And so therefore, my goal as a parent was to allow my child to make certain decisions on their own, and then they have to come up with a way of dealing with what the outcomes of that decision were, and not to allow them to escape those outcomes. Now, within reason, because a child can't appreciate or deal with all the possible outcomes yet. But the goal is to get them to the point where they begin making decisions for themselves on the basis of exactly what this viewer comment was talking about. The strongest child is the child who's going to be making the decisions they make because they realize, I don't want to make that decision, because if I do, these are the consequences we're all going to suffer, and I don't want to do that. So I'll make that decision. And the more that the child can own the outcomes of their decisions, the result of their choices, that's very useful. The other book that I liked on parenting, I hadn't read it in a long time, but it's actually a book written by somebody who is on TV. I don't care for his shows much at all, but his books are well written and full of some very useful information. Far more so than his shows are, and that's Dr. Phil. He wrote a book called Family First, and one of the things that he discusses in his book Family First is the fact that every child is a bit different, and most parents tend to pick a style of parenting that they are comfortable with, and he suggests you shouldn't do that. You certainly can't pick a style of parenting that you can't do. But he suggests that you should pick a style of parenting that seems to work well with the personality of your child, that helps that child to own their behavior. With some children, you're going to have to focus on certain kind of consequences. With another child, it may not be so much of a focus on the consequences. They may focus on those consequences just fine. Other children may focus too much on the consequences, and you may need to let them know what those consequences are, but kind of guide them in a different direction of what the options might be rather than the consequences. And consequently, the style that you use with a parent, with a child, depending on the child, might be very different. And that he recommends that you experiment with a variety of different parental skills in terms of learning how to plug into that modality and then use the modality that is most useful to your child. After all, its outcomes we're concerned about. And that I found to be very helpful. We have another viewer comment here. Let me read this. I don't agree. It doesn't require absolutes for relativity to exist. All relative things can be and are measured relative to other relative things. That seems to be, you're free to disagree. That seems to be the way. I think it's really just layers and layers and layers. But eventually you get down to a point where something has to be incontrovertibly stable. Although I think that when a system gets very complex, it can develop a great deal of variety and flexibility. But like the laws of physics provide for a great deal of relativity in certain ways, but also because of the laws of physics, which are in certain ways absolute. But neither here nor there. It's not a point I would feel I need to argue about. Your comment. I think the commenter's statement about punishment is interesting, but parents still need to step in, perhaps even with some gentle punishment, simply to maintain an orderly household. Maintaining an orderly household is there's a certain sense in which a household that's too chaotic is not a good environment for anyone to develop in. So there are certain things, but I don't know that punishment is necessarily, you say tomato, I say tomato. In some ways, we may be discussing that. To me, if punishment is merely a vindication, okay, you did this, so I get to do that to you. To me, that's useless. But I do think that that consequences are very important. That a child needs to know that that the consequences, particularly if the consequences are related to the actions and the choices of a child. This is why I think that Dinkmeyer book, Strategic Training for Effective Parenting, deals with the concept here of not so much of punishment, but of natural and logical consequences. For example, if your child throws a rock and breaks a neighbor's window, do you send the child to his room? Well, he's got his iPod in there, and he's got his Nintendo or his Wii, and his TV set, and all of his games and toys, and maybe his guitar. Sending him to his room is not a punishment, or you might ground him for 2 weeks. To me, these are useless gestures. Instead, I think it would make more sense. Okay, so you're going to go with me over to the neighbor's house, and you're going to have to apologize for what you did, and you're going to have to take responsibility. And, the child may not be able to earn the money to repair the window, but you might say, okay, now Dad has to buy them a new window. And because I'm going to be out the cash, you need to recognize that since you're the one who broke the window, I'm not the one who should be out for that. So although you don't have the money for the window, I'll buy the window, but you're going to have to do some things for me to kind of like pay me back for the money I'm out now because of what you did. And the child learns that some of the behaviors or restrictions or consequences that they might suffer are a direct result of their choices and their behavior, either logically or naturally. And as a result of that, it helps the child to recognize that, choices have outcomes, and that I need to suffer those outcomes if I'm going to learn not to indulge in them. But I also think that it's unless the outcome is going to somehow damage a child, it's never good to protect a child from the consequences of their own choices. They need to learn from those. I agree that an orderly household without punishment can be challenging, but I think semi-orderly household with no punishment and more discipline and guidance is a better deal. see what works for your kids, I would say. The sooner the child can be exposed to real world consequences, even if they are partially protected by their parent, the sooner they can gain valuable maturity. I totally agree with that statement. And there's nothing wrong with a bit of childlike chaos in the meantime. Oh, yeah. Hey, you're my kind of person. Yeah. We all need a little nonsense in our lives. And we need to, the children need to know that there's degrees of freedom and moments of radical freedom that, in addition to moments of less freedom and more structure. Viewer comment: I grew up in a chaotic household, but it was a creation of my parents. I would want to say that whatever household you grow up in, the people most responsible for having created it is always the parents. The child does not possess the critical skills or thinking to understand how various different policies affect the home. And not that all parents have that ability, but if anyone in that home is going to have that ability, it's going to have to be the parents, and it's the parents' responsibility to own that and to take it on. By the way, this wasn't intended to be a show about parenting as much as about morality, but in some sense, moral development is something that our children go through, and that is really, in many ways, directly related to the parenting issue. Viewer comment: I feel like I and the other commenters have derailed you from your topic, Bob. Sorry. I'm not sorry, but we can get back to the topic of morality. But it is very related, parenting, because the truth is, in a sense, parenting is the job of taking a child who comes into this world as a result of who the mom and dad might be as a couple, or taking a child that is nonetheless in this world through adoption, and then to try to prepare this child to be a useful member of the culture and of society, and to get from where a child doesn't know any of these things to where they can responsibly launch out and do this on their own. That's a big job, and it involves a philosophy of morality that the parent either is aware of having or isn't aware of having, and it involves an approach to this that either truly facilitates that development or hinders it. I grew up in a home where my dad was in control of everything and anything that he was aware of, and the things that he wasn't aware of, he had no control over and no realization of that he didn't have control over it. And as a result, I think in some ways, I tried to make sure there were certain areas of my life he just didn't have access to, so that he couldn't control it. That was, for me, a development of foolishness. And where he had control over me, it was a complete breakdown of any development as well. As it just didn't work. And I really had to go through, after leaving home at the age of 21, I really had to go through a radical reparenting, a process of just figuring out, who I am, what I'm being, and what it means to be a member of society, and all that. It was not an easy process, but I'd say that parental style didn't work. But I'm not necessarily going to blame my dad for that. I suppose that he came from a generation that was what they were thinking. That was what a lot of them thought their job was, and I suppose that there's a sense in which he tried to do his job in a way that was responsible in doing it and doing his duty. But I do think that he also saw within that opportunity ways in which it gave him leverage and advantage, and he took that leverage and advantage to himself, and without concern about the impact it had on his children. Because I'll tell you, his children did not do well under that. And it seems to me that when you go from the first child all the way down to the last child, that we see a developmental curve there of how bad it was for each of the 7 kids. Anyhow, enough about that. In thinking about this concept of morality, we need to take a look at, I'm going to argue that our real morality is based upon the outcomes of intentions, the outcomes of decisions, the outcomes of values adopted, the outcome of behaviors chosen and strategies adopted. That it's in all of these have to do with outcomes. And that this is where our real morality comes from. And when we think about outcomes, it's not just good enough that we think immediately. There are long-term outcomes and there are short-term outcomes. Sometimes the short-term outcomes are not pleasant, but the long-term outcomes are better. And I think that it's always far better to sacrifice when one is in a conundrum. That if I do this, the immediate result is good, but the eventual risks down the road are worse. But if I do this, the immediate response is not all that pleasant, but eventually this leads to a far better situation and position. This is sometimes a balance that we need to make. It's not always entirely clear where that would be, but I do think it's always better to, so long as the immediate unpleasantry can be endured without damage and without destruction, it's always better to sacrifice the present for the future. It's always a better thing to do that. It's better to go without while you're young and not having built up enough wealth before you start indulging yourself in all kinds of purchases with things that you really can't afford. But if you're approaching retirement and you've got things well stabilized and you indulge yourself with certain frivolous purchases, sometimes it's not as bad a thing. So but looking at various outcomes. But what I would also want to say is that it's not just important that we look at short-term and long-term outcomes. It's important that we look at the multi-axial ways in which there are outcomes that are different in different ways. There are social outcomes to the intentions, actions, and choices that we would make, the values that we would adopt. There are social outcomes. How is this going to affect various different groups of people as they interact with each other? I need to consider those outcomes in deciding on the actions that I would choose. I need to care about the impact that such choices and outcomes would have on different social groups, young versus the old, the wealthy versus the poor, the male versus the female, the neighbors versus our own home. The people who live in other countries versus the people who live here. I think that we need to recognize that these are all things held in a conundrum and balance. We need to think in terms of the social outcomes of the choices that we would make. We need to think in terms of the relational outcomes. How is this going to affect relationships? Sometimes there's such a thing as the right thing to do and the wrong way to go about doing it. Many times you hear Christians talk about, speaking the truth in love. And they think that if I tell you, well, you're going to hell and God thinks you are a piece of crap and he just can't stand the stench. And I'm telling you this because I love you. And, give me a break. But we need to be aware of these relational aspects. The love that we have. There's there are right things to do, right things to say, right things to reach as a goal, and wrong ways of going about doing it. To me, that sometimes that's just an excuse. Speaking the truth in love. Speaking the truth in love is really done by allowing a person to find it realistic and inviting to recognize that the truth is unavoidable, immutable, non-negotiable, and that you genuinely care. If you can communicate that you genuinely care about them, then you can speak the truth in love. But if you can't communicate all of that, there may not be a way of communicating a particular truth at a particular time, truly in love. Their timing, maybe, there's psychological outcomes. There are certain things. Kids need a balance. People need a balance. Relationships need a balance. And we need to think in terms of how the choices we make and the value in those choices affects ourselves and other people psychologically. There are developmental things. There are some things that you can deal with a teenager that you can't deal with a 5-year-old. And so we need to recognize that actions and choices need to be developmentally appropriate, developmentally, even sometimes in a social way too, where people have we can't have policies and procedures that just give constant advantage to certain classes of people, and just tell the other, you're on your own entirely to fight for this. We have another viewer comment. You go through struggle when your parents don't understand how to raise human beings. It's true. Let's not belittle our parents entirely. Very few people really stop to think about what does it really take to enable a human being to truly become all they really can be in a healthy way. This is not the kind of thing we really necessarily understand. And in fact, if there's one thing that's true about human nature, is that oftentimes we can deeply care about certain outcomes, but we go about terrible assumptions as to what will really achieve those outcomes. One of the things I remember that I discovered early on that kind of surprised me was years ago I was studying anorexia, nervosia, and bulimia, and some of these eating disorders, and discovered, of course, when I was looking at that, how it was common in industrial nations, and these eating disorders don't even occur at all in non-industrialized cultures. And taking a look at some of the things that seem to be contributing factors, or at least correlated factors, to anorexia. And it seemed to me that many times anorexia was caused by, or at least enabled by, a parental style that could exist on one of either extremes. And many times you would find somebody says, well, I don't want my usually it's more often daughters than sons, to become anorexic. And so we're going to make sure that we don't ever make food an issue. And when food is never an issue, this can sometimes be a way in which the child makes food the issue to bring a control that's missing. And then other parents might bring great control to it. And so sometimes an anorexic will grow up where there was control over food, and they're saying, well, I'm not going to make the mistake my parents made. I am going to do it this other way. And they avoid every sort of control. And what do? They create anorexic kids. Many times the very things that we assume will create a particular outcome or avoid a particular outcome ends up being the very thing that works just the opposite of the way we thought it would. And this is very common in human behavior. Many of the things that we do as managers, as parents, as authority figures, that we think are going to solve a problem, actually create the very problems we think we're solving. And so people are complex. Outcomes are not all that easy. And so it's not always easy to figure out just how to do this. And so, my heart goes out to people who are struggling with these decisions. And so I don't think it's always easy to, it's easier to badmouth our parents and not appreciate, even for them. And we all make mistakes, and we all can be selfish and inappropriate at times to understand what's going on here. But very few people are trained well enough to really appreciate how it is we go about truly enabling another human being to develop in a way that is good for them and good for all of us. And it's not an easy thing to do. It probably takes far more thought and education, and perhaps advice, help, guidance, and an assistance from others who might actually have more of that information than we do, and a kind of a humility and a willingness to actually admit that we don't know it all. None of us do. Anyhow, we have to think in terms of not just the psychological outcomes, but also the cognitive outcomes. What am I going to know? What am I going to be ignorant of? How are other people going to be knowledgeable or ignorant? And am I responsible for that? And, morality works in this way. As it comes down to it, morality is not an easy thing. It's something where, depending on your sense of conscience, your openness to being well educated, your genuine openness to recognizing that things lead to certain outcomes, even if it doesn't seem as though they should, your willingness to deal with all these things will help you to take another look at, to re-examine. And by the way, through every phase of life, there's a re-examination. This is part of how we shift from, the mindset of a toddler to the mindset of a preteen, to the mindset of a teenager, to the mindset of a young adult, the mindset of a person who's middle-aged, the mindset of a person who's reaching years of maturity, the mindset of a person who's elderly. These mindsets are very different, and it's because in the process of going through life, we go through various different stage and age appropriate reconsiderations of things that of insights we've acquired along the way. And it's ridiculous to sometimes require of people some of the insights that are not yet age appropriate or stage appropriate to them, although they should be warned about them if they can. But nonetheless, we go through this process of looking at morality by an examination of just really what are our intentions. What are the decisions we're making? Can we own those as the decisions we own, and therefore the outcomes that they produce? Can we own those as the outcomes we have contributed in some sort of a role in creating? And can I own those as the outcomes I'm creating? And the actions that I take in those decisions, the way that I go about doing it, the style that I go about doing it. If I am going to be concerned about the outcomes that these all lead to, it will certainly help me in developing a far more moral approach. But this comes down to really not a question of morality. Morality is something we struggle with in this process. But to me, the process eventually for a human being ends up dissolving. There's several ways of taking care of a problem. You can resolve a problem by finding an answer and coming up with a solution, and the problem gets solved. But a lot of problems in life, as we become older, are problems that dissolve. We find a way that causes the problem to no longer even be a problem, and it just kind of evaporates. And that this is, in a sense, the real goal of love. That when we get to the point where we can be well educated as to just what outcomes really exist, we can begin to focus simply more upon what it means to love another human being and to behave and act in a way that is loving based upon a recognition of the outcomes of intentions, decisions, actions, policies, styles, and all that. And we can think more in terms of loving them than really trying to rehearse through our mind the rubric of, okay, well, what kind of a decision am I making? Have I got, it really comes back more to what love is. So that I'm going to say that for the mature person, all of these questions of ethics and morality begin to just simply evaporate and dissolve when we decide that what we really need to do is learn what is love, what is not love, what is truly loving, what is not loving. And it's not always necessarily plain and simple and straightforward. And there's plenty of room for mistakes, errors, and differences of opinion. But that's the way that it works, and we can move towards that. So I want to move us away from this previous Christian concept that the Ten Commandments are the foundation of morality. They are not. They are, I do think, in some ways, a picture of what morality might look like, as an example. But they really have nothing to do with what actually creates morality. They just really point out where what goes wrong when it goes wrong, when morality simply doesn't really exist. And what we want is we want it to exist, not so that we are no longer violating laws, but so that people can live loved, so that we can all be in relationship with each other in a way that is truly conducive to our well-being and in a manner that balances the conundrums between our differences of need. So anyway, there we are, talking about morality a little bit. I'm Bob Greaves, the Unconventional Pastor. Thank you for spending some time with me. And I'll actually see you back here in about 10 minutes where I'll be with on the place where we're going to be talking about presuppositional apologetics. See you then. Take care.
Ladies and gentlemen, stick around in just a moment. On this very stage at the Florida NCG studios, Dr. Michael W. Jones and Rhonda Jones will be speaking with Greg Bray, Bob Greaves, our wonderful regular hosts, and special guests Sean Boatman and Dustin Seeger, who will be speaking to us about their worldview. They are of the somewhat of the Seitem Rugenkate philosophy. And so it should be fun, and we hope you'll stay with us. It'll be happening in just a few moments on The Place.